Hey, y'all, welcome back to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Live. I know we took a week off last week, but we're back with a brand new episode, and I'm so excited to be back with you all. My name is Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, and if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, we welcome you, and we hope that you return for future episodes after this one that you're going to enjoy. I can guarantee you that. And if you're someone who's a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back, and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So, before we get into our main event and introduce our first and only guest of tonight's show, let's remember to subscribe to YouTube. So, if you're on YouTube, right now, hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications for new episodes. If you're listening from Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can subscribe there as well. We also accept monetary donations for the podcast so we can continue to bring all these awesome guests into our show. You can donate through Cash App with the handle # ID Talk for Ed, or you could donate through Venmo with the handle at Kwame SM. And to check out past episodes of the podcast, you can go to our main website at IDTALK4EDucators.com. Thank you so much. So, today's episode is one that I think will intrigue a lot of you. So, we know that reading has always been a hot issue in our schools. We talk about different approaches to reading, and it's changed over the years. I know that when I was in school, majority of my teachers, not even majority, I would say 100% of my teachers for sure used basal readers where you had those big bulky textbooks or teacher guides, and they would read reading selection, which we would all read together as a class. And then after that, there'll be some questions we have to answer for comprehension. And then there may be some activities that we do at certain stops of the reading selection. And then you may do some phonics work in isolation, and then you go to the next selection. So that's how I'm sure a lot of us who are around my age range learned how to read and write. But as time has gone on, we've discovered new approaches. So there's guided reading, we have running records. I know some of us were doing DRA assessments to determine instructional and independent reading levels. I know now there's a talk about science of reading. There's been talks about whole language learning. So we're going to get into all these different concepts and approaches to reading, because we all know that if our students don't know how to read, it makes it very hard for them to access all the other content areas. But I'm not the one that can speak in depth about it. I have somebody who's going to come on who is an expert when it comes to reading, when it comes to getting our students to be thriving readers, and she's going to drop a lot of gems tonight. I'm telling you. So, without further ado, I want to go ahead and bring on Shannon Moore to the podcast to share her story, but also how can we get our babies to read so they can thrive, not just in school, but in life. So let's go ahead and bring Shannon on to talk about reading. Hey, Shannon.
Hi, how are
How are
you?
we doing? I'm
I'm
good. How
do-
are you feeling?
I'm doing good. I'm doing great. Great to be here. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for coming on. And I know we've been doing the DMs on IG for some months. So
Right,
I'm finally
right,
glad that we can see each other face
right,
to face, albeit virtually.
right.
So for those who aren't familiar with how Shannon and I connected, if I'm not mistaken, Shannon, it was through a mutual colleague that we know through social media. I think it
Right.
was D, right? D
Yes,
connected.
yes.
So for those who don't know, D or Deidre Fogarty, Black Girls Teach.
Hmm.
She does an awesome job advocating for Black women educators, does a
Yes.
lot of advocacy work in terms of empowering Black women educators. So if you're not familiar with Black Girls Teach, make sure y'all subscribe to them on all social media platforms. But Shannon, I know when we connected, you're trying to get your voice out there and talk more
Mhm.
about what you love so much, reading. And I know that I was able to connect with you and help you with an article, which we'll talk more about
Mhm.
when we get deeper into our conversation. But before we even do that, there's always a story to the story. Before we became educators, we
Mhm.
had a life before that, which for some of us didn't involve thinking we're going to be teachers. Maybe we had other career endeavors that we wanted to pursue. But I'm just curious to learn about how you grew up and how you got to where you are. So just take some time to share with the audience who or what inspired you to become an educator.
Well, a couple things. One, I would have to say, is one of my elementary teachers, Mrs. Chupek. She was like my favorite teacher, and I always looked up to her. So, because of that, I would come home every night after school and play school, if you will. So, I would be at home. It was to the point where I was like playing teacher so much that my family actually bought me a chalkboard. So they bought me a chalkboard. I would play with that. And even at the time, my sister was a baby, like in the carrier, I would have her as one of my students. Like I would bring her, bring her into the room, teach to her. And then I remember one time my mom came and she saw the baby in the hallway. She's like, "Why is she in the hallway?" And I was like, I said, she wasn't listening. So I put her out. So from there, I just loved teaching. Wanted to be a teacher. Again, it was a thing that was my play, if you will. And then I had family members who were teachers. And so a lot of them would try to push me to become a teacher. And they say, "Oh, don't you want to be a teacher?" And I would have to say, from like the elementary aspect, like K through 8, I wanted to be a teacher, but then things changed as I ventured into high school. And once I got into high school, it was, oh, the money's not here. The money's not in teaching. The money's in business. I think we're around the same generation. And at that time, it was the money's in business. The money isn't here for teachers. So I started to think, okay, well, I want to be in business, and went to college. And because again, that's where it was. Went to college and majored human resource management and graduated with a bachelor's degree in human resource management. And once I graduated, 9/11 happened and there
Wow.
were no, yes. So think about that. I'm a recent grad, and grads, you're coming out, you're looking for a job, and there were no jobs. So my mom suggested, she said, "Hey, why don't you just go substitute teach? See how you like it." And so I did. And I did that for maybe about a year and a half, and then loved it, fell back in love with teaching again, and went back to school to get my master's in teaching and teaching certification at the same time. And then after that, once I was teaching, decided to go back and get my education specialist certificate for reading. So that's pretty much.
Awesome. Now, your family, do you have any members who are also educators, or are you the only one?
No, I have my aunt and uncle were actually high school history teachers. So they were very instrumental in me becoming a teacher. And then I had like a few distant relatives who were teachers, and also friends of the family who were educators. So I was surrounded by a lot of educators growing up.
All right, cool, cool. So the name of the podcast is Identity Talk. So there's always a few questions that I have for guests where we
Mhm.
delve into the identities of our audience and guests. But I'm wondering, growing up, going through your K-12 schooling, were there any challenges or struggles that you encountered as far as embracing who you were as a child at that time? And did that prevent you from showing up authentically in the different school spaces you were in?
That's a good question. My K through 12 schooling goes across a span of spectrums. So K8, Kwame, I was actually at a Catholic school. So K8 Catholic
Wow.
school. Yes. So you know what that was. It was uniforms. Nuns were my teachers. It was stand in a straight line. Exchanges were walking in a straight line, no talking, no chewing gum. Like it was very strict. It was mass every week. So it was very strict. But then my high school, 9 through 12, I went to public school. So, right there, when we talk about identity, or kind of not so much identity, but maybe finding your tribe, because from going from K through 8 and going as a in a Catholic school, and then 9 through 12 in a public school, that was a shock. That was a culture shock for me. So going through that was it was a shock, because I remember coming home telling my mom during the exchange, my first exchange in ninth grade, and the bell rings and the kids, they just came pouring out of the classroom. And I kind of got scared, like, oh my gosh, wait a minute. Because I'm so used to you stand in line, stand straight in line, no talking. So I would say my freshman year was very difficult, because again, not many of my friends from my K through 8 school went to the same high school as I did. So it took me a minute, like I said, to find my tribe, if you will. It wasn't until I got into modern dance and we had to have an elective. They tried to put me in swim, didn't want to swim. They tried to put me in
Mhm.
like PE class, didn't want to do that either. So they suggested modern dance was to meet the PE requirement to graduate. So once I got in there, I made new friends, and then from there, discovered a love of cheerleading. So from there, I was able again to kind of find my niche, find my group. So that helped, because, like I said, I haven't even touched on just going more in depth into private school and public school and how big of a shock that was. It was tough.
Yeah, I know we all go through those stages where we're trying to figure things out. We're trying to figure out who we are. I mean, your
Mm-hmm.
story is not a foreign one by any means. So you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned modern dance, you mentioned human resource management, you've mentioned all these things, but I'm sitting here trying to wonder how and when did reading come into your life? How did you discover that love?
It's a interesting story. When I was a child, again, it goes back to me having that love of playing school. Before I could read, when I was, 4 or 5, whatever, I had an older cousin. She would always read to me. And I was someone who I loved escapism. And so when people would read to me, even as a child, I would just, as one of the comprehension strategies, I was a good visualizer. I visualize a lot. So my family, they would read to me, my aunt, my mom. Anytime we would go to the mall back in those days, we had bookstores at the mall. So anytime I was there, it was, yeah, you're right. Now we don't, but I miss that. But every time I went to the mall, I would always go to the bookstore and they would say, pick out a book. For me, it wasn't so much the toys at that time. It was, okay, let's go in here, let's find a book. So it started out with my family reading to me. And then as I got maybe in the fourth grade or so, I developed a love of chapter books and started reading chapter books. Well, some of those books that I read were on the banned book list now. And one that was
Mm.
my favorite was Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And that's actually now a banned book. Interesting. But so I read that, and actually I have a funny story, just a segue. When I went to my Catholic school that closed, they had like a big party closing, a mass back in, I think, 2008. And they let us do a tour of the school, and they had the library open and they had books out. And one of my former classmates, she said, Shannon, come look at this book. And it was Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And I had checked it out. Remember, you had the little checkout card.
Yeah,
And
sure.
yes,
Yep, yep.
my name was like on the whole first side of the card. So I did a love of reading. And then from there, I started reading chapter books. In those days, it was Sweet Valley Twins. It was the Adventures of the Babysitters Club. It was Little House on the
Mhm.
Prairie, those series. So I got really big into that. Then when I got into about middle school, I started reading more banned books. But again, they weren't banned at that time. So I had a friend who, she was a big avid
Sure.
reader. And on her desk, I remember she had It by Stephen King. And it was a thick book, like thick. And I'm like, that looks interesting. She's like, you want to borrow it? I was like, sure. So started reading that. And to this day, like, I cannot pick up a Stephen King book. And then so I started reading, like, again, it was just me going into the escapism, reading those books. And then, of course, my mom saw me reading that. She's like, why are you should be reading that? Then she also borrowed a book from a friend, the another book that wasn't for kids. But I was reading anything I could read at the time. The V.C. Andrews Flowers in the Attic. Now that is a very as an adult, when I saw the movie, I was like, oh, I guess I shouldn't have been reading that. So my mom, she saw me reading that too. She's like, nope, give that back to her. But again, I just started reading that, and then eventually went into autobiographies. My parents had autobiographies. I was reading everybody's autobiography: Patti LaBelle, Tina Turner, Quincy Jones, like everybody. So I just started developing this love of reading, and it continued on. And as a young adult, getting into college, I was an avid reader, went more towards autobiographies, biographies, and memoirs. But then I started teacher college,
Mm-hmm.
and I started teaching. And when I started teaching, you know how it goes. It's You're inundated with lesson plans. You have to read for lesson planning. And I got to the point where reading became more of a chore than a pastime for me. So, with that, I stopped reading. And I almost started to regret my career. Like, this is the thing that I loved. I'm doing what I love. I'm teaching kids to read, but I started
Wow.
to feel a certain way about it because, like I said, it was like, this is work. This isn't enjoyment anymore. Your
Right.
professional developments, it turned into, okay, read this article, now journal, give a read response, write this paper about this. It was just too much for me. So I just stopped. And then I think I was probably down to maybe a book a year. And after that, I just entered the pandemic. And that's when my life changed. I had a tremendous loss, lost my husband unexpectedly. And still during this time, it's only been a year and a half. And to help cope with grief, my family once again started buying me books. And it started out as grief books. My aunt, who is now a retired teacher, bought me
Mm-hmm.
grief books. The grief book sat on the table from February to May. And then I picked it up, read it as needed. But then I needed that escapism again. I needed something to get my mind off of the grief. So I started looking at realistic fiction books. And some of them had the theme of a widow's journey or things like that. So that slowly brought me back to my love of reading. And we'll talk about more slowly having me to relaunch my tutoring business as well.
Well, first and foremost, I'm sorry for your loss. It's always tough when you lose a family member. I've had over the past few years, and it's always tough to deal with that, especially as you get
Mhm.
older. It feels like
Mhm.
more and more death happens around you. But so you mentioned that you started to find your love for reading, and then eventually you became a reading specialist. So now
Mhm.
you're helping other teachers and well help their better readers. So now I'm wondering, when you're observing teachers teach reading to their students, what are some of the common errors that you see happen in the classroom when teachers are attempting to teach students how to read?
So I'm going to say the errors aren't with teachers and teaching students how to read. The errors are in teacher preparation programs and training development. So, just like anybody, teachers, what you're trained to do, you're going to do. So, I even have to be honest. I went through my teaching training program, went through that for how many years. And we were taught, and I think I even mentioned it in the article, we were taught a lot of whole language and maybe like a sprinkle of phonics. So when I graduated and came out of teacher college, it was okay, well, I'm going to do what I know. This is what I was taught. And then the same thing as I began to work for various school districts, they purchased certain reading programs. And within that reading program, they purchase a training package as well. So when we have the trainer come in and he or she works with us, it's okay, I'm assuming what they're saying is correct because they are the sage on the stage. I am putting my trust in them. They are representing this product in this publishing company, so what they're saying must be correct. But as I went on in the classroom and working with my students, now mind you, I worked for my 20-year career. I have been in Title I schools. I've always served that population. So with that population, the reading scores tended to be lower, say, versus your suburban schools. So I noticed that these programs, my kids needed something more. It was, okay, we have the bells and whistles, we have the schedule, we have your pacing guide, your scope and sequence, and on day 2, you should be on page 2 in lesson 2. And I was doing all of that. And I was like, wait a minute, something's missing. They need more. They're not just getting the reading of this story and answering the questions at the back of the story and sprinkling in some vocabulary questions. It wasn't, for lack of a better word, it wasn't jiving. I had to do something else. So from there, I began to like do research on my own, figure out, okay, what else can we do? And then when I started looking at these basal programs, and not all of them, some of them had a phonics component. Some did, some didn't. When I started talking to my colleagues, like in kindergarten and first grade, I was looking at their scope and sequence. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Why do you all have this extensive phonics section and me in second and third grade, we don't? It doesn't make sense. And I kept saying, my kids still need it. They still need it. And Kwame, that was like, I shouldn't have said that. That caused a big war.
Mhm.
It got to the
Wow.
point where I would find myself in the middle of a battle with the trainers of said programs. So I was having the conversation so I brought this to the principal saying, students need phonics after kindergarten. And I got a lot of pushback. And the program that I was using at the school district at the time told the principal, and they had the trainer of the program come talk to me. And, she sat me down and, well, this is why we have phonics in kindergarten. And she's just going on and selling me a story. So I said, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you. It was just going to be a nonstop battle. So I did what all teachers do, old school. I went in my classroom, shut my door, and I taught the way I felt that would serve my students best. And I started to incorporate phonics with the basal program.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. Hope to hear from you. And let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. I know that's right. Do
Mm-hmm.
what you gotta do, sis. I
Right.
know that's right.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes. But it's amazing how so many of us put a lot of blind trust into these different companies and these different programs. I know when I first started teaching, it was all about either Fontes and Pinnell or Lucy Calkins. They were the gurus that you followed when it
Mm-hmm.
came to literacy. But then over time, different approaches came about. So I know that you wrote an article talking about a raging debate that's happening in
Mm-hmm.
our reading circles.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to go ahead and pull up the article because I have it right here so we could talk about it. Your article
Mm-hmm.
focused on science of reading versus whole language.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an article that you wrote few months back,
Mm-hmm.
and I can remember when I read it and you shared this with me,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, this is so spot on, because some of the approaches that you shared in this article are a lot of the same things I did with my son as I was helping him learn how to read during the pandemic period. So I'd love for you to just share what inspired you to write this article and just to touch on a little bit about science of reading versus whole language for those who may not be familiar with those approaches.
So, like everyone else, all the educators, I was inspired to write this article by listening to Sold a Story. It was a podcast by the educational journalist Emily Hanford. And I think it was a 6-part series in which she kind of blew the door open on how students are learning how to read. I really think, once again, the pandemic that really opened up Pandora's box about learning how to read because everyone was home. We were doing
Right.
virtual, and parents were starting to see how their child was being taught. So that opened up debate that's happening now. So I was actually listening to it, and this was again at the height of my grief because I needed that escapism again. And I saw on social media a lot of educators who I follow, they were talking about this. Like it was everybody was talking about this podcast. I'm like, what are they talking about? I was like, I gotta listen to this. So I saw it and it was 6 parts. I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna get through this. But Kwame, once I put it on part 1, I said, this is it. This is what I've been trying to tell people for the past 20 years. And so as I listened to each episode, I started to journal. And I just journaled my thoughts and just journaled because so much of this were my experiences as a teacher. And so I just started to journal. And then I saw, on the other hand, some of these experiences that some of my tutoring students and former students had to deal with. So journal. And then when I got finished writing, I looked at it. I was like, wait a minute, this looks like an opinion piece. So I kind of put it to the side. I kept going back to it and I kept thinking about it. I was like, wait a minute, could I write this? Could this become like an article? So got in touch with some people, and a mutual friend put us in contact, and the rest is history. I was put in touch with you, and I am grateful for our connection and our newfound educational friendship because you helped me with my article journey. And so I thank you. That's how it came about. That's the story behind that.
Yeah, and people, make sure you go on the EdPost website to check out Shannon's article on science of reading and whole language learning. It is an incredible article. If you're a parent that's trying to figure out how to help your son or daughter or whoever you have in the household read, this is the article that's going to give you some important information on how you can go about doing that. And hopefully it's not the last article that you write.
Right. And that's what I'm thinking. And then too, I'm just, as we're sitting here talking, I'm looking at the first line. That also helped me write this article because not only my past experience as a teacher, but working with some of my tutoring students, I had my student reading, just regular reading a book. And every time he would come to an unknown word, he just stared at me. And so I stared at him, and we're just like having this stare down, but we're communicating with our eyes because I felt like he was asking me or telling me, I need help. I don't know what this word means, or I don't know how to read this word. And I'm telling him via my eyes, don't you know how to pronounce this word? Don't you know how to decode? Didn't your teacher tell you this? You should know this because you are attending one of the highest and most richest schools in the state. So those were the questions that were going through my mind. And that's how I started the article because we had just had that situation happen. And so many things were going through my mind. I'm like, okay, come on now. First of all, you're in 2nd grade. And you mean to tell? And so then from there, I started to give him an assessment on vowels, consonants. He didn't know any of them. So then I started to think more and dig deeper, like, okay, again, where's the disconnect? And then I started thinking, okay, well, he was in kindergarten and 1st grade during the pandemic, so maybe that's it. But still, again, something was missing. Just like with my students years ago, they have it, but it's something that wasn't there. So after doing some digging, and I mentioned in the article and reached out to his teacher, just asked what reading program they have. And of course, it was the Fontes and Pinnell, the Lucy Calkins. And I said, oh, I got it. And I said, well, what phonics program do you use? And it was Lucy Calkins Units of Study, the phonics add-on that came years later. And I said, okay, it makes sense.
Interesting. Because when I was teaching my son how to read, and I shared this with you via DM on IG, we came across this book, and the name of the book is escaping me right now. but basically it's a book that focuses on letter sounds and blends. So each lesson builds upon the previous
Mhm.
lesson, and you're going from learning single sounds to now learning blends, and then eventually you start to read words. So usually when you're learning how to read at the elementary level or early childhood level, as you already know,
Mhm.
we always have the big list of sight words that you should
Mhm.
know at each grade. If you're in kindergarten, you should know these 100 sight words. This is what you need to commit to memory. But the way this book was structured, it was basically no, we're going to use phonics
Mhm.
and the rules of phonics in order to
Mhm.
read these words. So it was a more organic process. And
Mhm.
what's amazing was by the time my son was 2.5 years old, he is reading, he's decoding words.
Mhm.
And then from that point on, the fluency just got stronger. And now
Mhm.
he's reading pretty
Mhm.
seamlessly at 5 years old.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to know, just from your own research with either the science of reading or whole language, what's your perspective on that approach of just memorizing sight words, just the things that we've seen in many reading classrooms?
So let's kind of define them.
Yeah.
So, whole language is a theory based on Marie Clay's approach to reading, in which students learn to read by guessing words that they don't know. And it relies on a three cueing system in which they read the unknown word. So basically, it's a lot of guessing. Also, within that approach, it states that the classroom should be set up as this in the right environment, that you should have reading nooks, students should have their own books, you should have dim lighting. And if you do all these things, the students will read. Well, that didn't always happen. So that was the whole
Mhm.
language approach. But then when you look at, on the other hand, phonics, which falls under the science of reading, and just to kind of paraphrase, the science of reading is a science based approach in which students decode or sound out words to make meaning from the text. So, in this approach, for me, that has been the desired approach, and gotten my desired results. And you talk about, going back to your question, that memorizing words. Well, that was that whole language approach. It was just
Mhm.
sit here and memorize. And again, my first year's teaching, you should have seen me, Kwame. I had the flashcards. I had, okay, let's go. And I'm
We all did.
yeah, drill and kill. Okay, come on. Why aren't they getting it? And again, it was like, it's still something's off. They're not getting it. And so when I started to delve deeper into phonics, I started to learn that sight words can be sounded out. And a lot of people are kind of afraid of phonics, if you will, because they think that, oh, it's too many rules. That's what I hear a lot. There are too many rules for the students to memorize. They have to memorize these rules. And then I hear a lot of talk that the phonics words are irregular. They're too irregular. They don't follow the common English language. But in my research, I've taken a lot of those words, and I would say, maybe, don't quote me, but I'm saying roughly probably about 87% of those sight words can be sounded out. Because if you look at them, they have a phonics skill within them. There are only a few that have words or letters that make a sound that don't follow certain patterns. But that is where I think we need to debunk that myth that sight words need to be memorized and drill and kill, but they don't.
Okay. See, I always thought that sight words, well, most of them had to be memorized because a lot of the sight words, particularly at the early childhood level,
Mhm.
are monosyllabic, right? So it's just one syllable. There's not much you can do as far as sounding out. That
Mhm.
was my initial thought. But then as I started to go through the book that I mentioned, I realized, oh no, there's an actual science to how you
Mhm.
can do that,
Mhm.
where you
Mhm.
can sound out each individual letter
Mhm.
and then eventually blend it to
Mhm.
form the word, as you're mentioning.
Right. And there are even now a lot of science of reading, phonics instructors, gurus. They are now, I like a lot of their programs and things that they have created. Now they're creating phonics scope and sequences, and they break up the sight words and say, okay, if you're teaching, let me just say digraphs, okay, these are some of the sight words you should teach. If you're teaching if you're introducing short A vowels, here's some of the sight. So they take the sight words and actually show you when to teach them instead of here's a list, here are your index cards, have at it. And again, like I said, I had to, as an educator, I had to like retrain my whole thinking, because again, when I go back to your original question about what errors are teachers making in the classroom, again, it's not the teachers making the errors, it's the training preparation programs and the professional developments that are training teachers in a way that leans more towards whole language.
All right. And I know we're winding down, but I have a couple of questions. This is an important one because when I was getting my second certification in moderate disabilities for grades 5 through 12, one of the tests I had to take was a foundations of reading test. And this was during the summertime. So I had time to study. I had time to watch lots of Sesame Street with my baby son at the time. And I'm going through the elements, the foundational elements of reading. So I'm learning about phonemic awareness. I'm learning about phonological awareness. I'm learning about rhyming. And then I'm going into graphemes and phonemes and all these other components. Like I'm really delving into it. And for 2 months, I felt like a reading guru. At least
Right,
enough
you
to
should,
pass
yeah.
the test because it was a
Right.
lot of stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
But as you're talking, I realized that's how a lot of teachers learn how to teach reading. They take these tests like the one that I mentioned, but then they're going into the classroom and they're relying on the basal readers and all these other programs that may not have all the requisite components necessary to teach children how to read properly. So, in saying that, I'm wondering of all the foundational elements of reading that are important, which one do you believe is the most critical for students to learn and why?
I knew this question was coming. So, first of all, the 5 foundational pillars of reading is what I talk about. I incorporate those in my tutoring sessions, and also I did as a classroom teacher. So, the 5 foundational pillars of reading, they go under many names. The 5 pillars of reading, there's so many different names for them,
Right.
but I knew them as the pillars. So,
Sure.
it's phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. As an educator, reading teacher, I can't really say that one is more important than the other. So I can't say, oh, you need this one or you need, because they all build upon each other. You can't
Right.
have one without the other. Just like if you do not know how to decode, that means you are missing out on your phonemic awareness and your phonics skills. So if you lack that, you're going to have trouble with your comprehension. So, and then from your phonemic awareness and phonics, you build upon your fluency, because once you're able to process those sounds, which is the phonemic awareness part, and then the phonics, you're able to blend those sounds and further manipulate those sounds, then you have to be able to read it fluently. You have to read at a decent rate. You have to read automatically, your intonation. And then from there, once you have that down, then it's okay. I'm reading and it's like, okay, I get to an unknown word. I don't know what this word means. I have to have skills, context clues. I have to know synonyms. I have to know antonyms on how to find the meaning of unknown words. And then from there, then I can comprehend what this story or even this paragraph is about.
Sure.
So I can't say one is more important because they all build upon each other, but I will go back to the foundation, which is phonics. If you don't have that foundation, then everything else, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, are going to be a difficult task.
And that we can agree on for sure.
Right.
Now, before I get to the closing question, I do want to give you a chance to talk about more literacy leaps. And we definitely need them in this day and age.
Yeah.
More
Right.
leaps in literacy.
Right.
Love to play on words.
Right.
Very punny. So, what services do you provide through more literacy leaps?
Mhm.
And I know you talked earlier about the inspiration
Mhm.
behind doing tutoring work around this,
Mhm.
but just share some of the services that you offer right now.
So right now at More Literacy Leaps, I help K through 5 students with reading interventions so that they can become confident readers. So I'm just working with literacy. And Kwame, I've had parents, they're they're calling me and texting me, do you do math too? And I'm like, no, I'm sorry.
Mm,
But so yes, I offer those services. In the new year, I can announce that More Literacy Leaps also will be segueing into the parent and teacher consulting and coaching area. So thank you. I've had over the years, I've had so many parents come to me about their child's reading. And it's always after parent teacher conference. I will have parents call me frantic, like, Shannon, they just said my child can't read. They said that my child is going to be held back and they're going to be tested. And so I have to first calm the parent down, reassure them, but I also have to let the parents know their rights. In this day and age with interventions, I'm not sure what at your school or the previous schools that you've taught at, back in, was it 2008, they passed the law for the reading RTI, response to intervention framework.
yes.
So with that, that's where I came into play, especially as a reading specialist, because when you start looking at the tier system, reading specialists were needed in tiers 2 and tier 3. So with that, I became the RTI, or some schools now call it MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support. I became that coordinator as well. So working in that, a lot of times I had to be the spokesperson, if you will, for the MTSS team to talk to the parent and let them know that their child will be in interventions. A lot of times that didn't go over well. Sometimes it did, because a lot of times I thought, well, the classroom teacher had already kind of talked to the parent to say, hey, just a heads up, your child we're thinking about putting them in interventions. And sometimes that wasn't the case. So
Mm,
I was kind of in front of the firing squad, if you will, sometimes, because the parents would be blindsided sometimes. When they would receive a letter from me in the mail or a phone call, their first response was, what are you talking about? I've talked to the teacher. She didn't tell me anything. So with that, and this was years ago, I found myself consulting and talking to parents about the process and telling them what rights they have. You are allowed to go to your MTSS meetings. At the time, it was, I think, child study meetings. You are allowed to ask for your results and your child's results and progress monitoring. A lot of the stuff the parents didn't know. So that is why I decided to kind of segue into consulting parents. And then the other piece is I want to start working with teachers as well, coaching them in the intervention process, because once again, going back to teacher college, we didn't get trained on interventions. There were no interventions, weren't even a thing back when I was in college.
right.
They weren't a thing. So again, that was another on the job training. So once I became the reading specialist at my schools, a lot of the teachers would come to me and ask for advice and say, hey, Shannon, I need help with this phonics lesson. Can you help me? And then it got to the point where I became the RTI coordinator as well. I had to put together school-wide intervention schedules.
Mm,
So I had to help the teachers with their centers, because at on the elementary level, we ran our interventions as 1 hour centers. So I would go into the classroom, work with the classroom teacher, and saw my groups, and the teacher saw her groups. So we had to plan. So I had to go in and plan with the teachers and talk with them. And a lot of times they're like, Shannon, well, I don't know, I need a fluency lesson. What can you do? And so it got to the point where I was holding professional developments. The administration would ask me to give them a training on, like you said, multisyllabic words. How do you do comprehension? How do we teach fluency? So I had to do that. So, and then even to this day, I still have some of my former coworkers who are now friends calling me, asking me, hey, Shannon, I have this lesson. I need help with phonics. So that's how I decided to segue into the parent and teacher consulting part of More Literacy Leaps.
And guess what? Parents and teachers are blessed to have you as a consultant when it comes to reading.
Yeah.
Shannon, listen, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. This has been a great conversation. I wish there was more time to talk about this because it's so important.
Mhm.
So important. But for those that do want to connect with you beyond this episode, how can they reach you on social media. And feel free to share the More Literacy Leaps website as well so they can learn more about your services.
Yes, they can find me at Moore, that is Moore, literacyleaps.com. That is my website. And then I can also be found on Instagram at More Literacy Leaps.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And hopefully we will connect soon
Yes,
for a part two because
yes.
there's more that we left on the table
Yes,
for
we did.
sure.
Yes, yes. And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you. You have a good rest of the day.
You too.
All right. All right, y'all. So about to end another episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. Hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, I'm wishing you all a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we are going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.